Audio
Are you ready?
We're good. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, this evening we're really grateful to have Dr. Richard Steckel with us. He graduated from San Jose State University with a bachelor's degree and received a master's degree in aviation safety from the University of Central Missouri and a PhD in aviation from St. Louis University. He has over 4,000 hours as a commercial pilot and flight instructor. Spent about 24 years at Boeing St. Louis as a quality engineer on the F-18, the C-17, and the 787 Dreamliner, and 5 years at St. Louis University at the Center for Aviation Safety Research. So he certainly has the credentials for the program he's about to present. So welcome, Richard. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. This is going to be a little bit different, not going to be your typical Amelia Earhart presentation where we look at what happened to her, did she survive. We're going to treat this as a NTSB accident investigation. There's some factors now that we have that weren't available or weren't known about back then. We're going to apply to the accident. So we'll treat it as though it happened a couple of weeks ago. So just a quick review on Amelia Earhart. She was born in 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. Died, we think, July 2nd, 1937 near Howland Island in the Pacific. She was the first woman to cross the Atlantic. It's interesting to put that, the way they put that, if you read it, it says first woman to cross. She was actually a passenger in an airplane. She wasn't flying. She sat next to a mailbag. But in 1932, she was the first woman to fly the Atlantic solo, after Charles Lindbergh had done it in 1927. So that era of 1927, 1930s, everybody was trying to be the first to cross some body of water. She was a charter member and first president of the 99s, which is a women's flying group, which promotes aviation for women. They're still in existence today. There's lots of chapters around the United States. Actually, one of my first girlfriends was a member of that. It was a great organization. She was a supporter of women's rights, and being a pilot, you have to be assertive and make decisions, and that's sort of the type of person that's going to be a supporter of women's rights. And something interesting, she survived the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Just like we went through a pandemic, so did she. This is our birthplace in Atchison, Kansas. It's now a museum that you can go through. One of our trips, about 12 years ago, we were able to go through the museum. It was very, very interesting. I suggest it be a nice weekend trip up to Atchison. It's a beautiful part of Kansas. She was the 16th woman to obtain a pilot's license in 1923, which is very, very early. She was licensed by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, FAI for short. It was an flying organization that did licensing then, because the United States did not start licensing pilots until 1926. So if you wanted to fly an airplane before then, have at it. Didn't require lessons or anything else. Just, yeah. She disappeared on her second attempt to circumnavigate the world at the equator. She had tried, the first time she had tried from Oakland, she got as far as Hawaii and crashed on takeoff there. So they ended up bringing the airplane back to Oakland, fixed it up, and got it ready for the second attempt. No one has absolutely determined where she crashed or if she survived, with Fred Noonan, who was her navigator. Again, you can go out on the internet, do some research, and there are scads of theories of what happened to her. Some say she ended up a prisoner of the Japanese. Someone else says she was doing spying for the United States prior to World War II. So go ahead and read those at your own risk. We're just going to look at the facts. So what will be presented today? We're going to look at what may have caused Amelia to disappear on her last leg of the trip from Papua New Guinea to Howland Island. And like I said, we're going to do this as a modern day accident investigation with all the tools and research that we have now. We can delve a little deeper into some of the factors that may have caused her to crash. We will not say what happened to her and Fred Noonan and where they might have crashed or landed. We're not even going to go there. So, final leg of the trip, factors that influenced. We're going to be looking at human factors. This is something that's hasn't been looked at since, started in the 1970s. Up until then, it was always equipment we were looking at, and we never got around to looking at the human factor, what may have caused the crash. So we'll explore that. We'll look at the equipment she had, the aircraft, her radios, navigation, her training and experience. That's something the NTSB does in an accident. They look at how well the pilots were trained, what kind of experience they had, were they qualified to be on that flight. We'll look at what she had for navigation. No GPS back then. It was all dead reckoning or using landmarks. There wasn't much in the way of navigation. And then we'll talk about the arrival in the vicinity of Howland Island, some of the things that went on there that could have gone better. So getting to human factors, this is a chart of how accident investigation and aviation safety has gone through the years. In the 1950s, we were looking at technical factors. Airplanes were not very reliable back then. If you went to the airport to go on a flight, you could get flight insurance for one flight. That's how a lot of people perceived it. So there was a lot of technical issues with flying back then. In the 1960s and 70s, we started getting turbine airplanes, jet engines, which were much more reliable, much safer, much better, and a lot of those technical factors went away. So now we start looking at, well, maybe it's human factors. Maybe the pilots are doing something to cause these crashes. Because even back in the 1950s, if they couldn't find a technical factor, they would write it off to pilot error. And it was even more convenient if the pilot was dead and couldn't defend himself. So they'd write off pilot error, shouldn't have been doing that. And that was the end of the investigation and the end of human factors. And then in the 80s and 90s, as we got a handle on human factors, we started looking at organizational factors. And we're still looking at that today as far as how the organization affects how the outfit works, or how the organization or how the airline works. And we'll look at some of that with Amelia Earhart's, because some organizational factors did go into this. So the flight schedule. It was very, very, very ambitious. Circumference of the Earth, so we're talking almost 24,000 miles. When they got to Howland, they were in day 33 of their trip. So they had covered probably about 2/3 of that in 30 days. In that 30 days, they only had 8 days with no flying. 1 day was a scheduled crew rest out of that 33 days, which we look at today as far as fatigue were going. She had to be tired. So they had 1 day of scheduled crew rest on June 5th. And when they left for Howland, it was in July, so it had been a month since they'd had a scheduled crew rest. They'd had 5 days of maintenance, 1 day where they couldn't fly a weather, and then 1 day where they actually did say on day 31, they said between the weather, the time change, time check, they decided they were unfit for flight. So they did look at human factors 1 day. They should have looked at that before they went to Howland Island. So there is a clue that they were thinking about being tired. So here was the flight. It shows it starting in Hawaii. They actually started, the airplane was there. It actually went by ship to Oakland so they could fix it after the crash in Hawaii. And then they ferried it to Miami where the flight officially started. So before she even started flying, they'd had 3 or 4 days of flying before that, plus 3 time changes. And you see they basically followed the shoreline down to Brazil, and then there was a hop across to Senegal, which was pure ocean. Again, they followed sort of the shoreline until they got to Papua New Guinea. The flight to Howland was going to be the longest overwater flight so far on the trip. It was going to be longer than the Brazil to Senegal leg. And we'll talk about how that leg went. So, human factors, we're back to that again. They were most likely suffering from chronic fatigue after being on the road for 33 days. The day before she left Miami, she had her 3rd molar removed. So she had dental work the day before. So she couldn't have been feeling too good. And she also was suffering chronic sinusitis as a result of the Spanish flu. So there was some residual health issues with the Spanish flu. So all that's going to affect your flying, especially if you go up 7,000 or 8,000 feet, and you have sinusitis, your ears aren't going to clear, you're going to have clogged ears, it's going to be painful. If you've ever had blocked ears in an airplane, the saying I always said, at first you think you're going to die, and then you're afraid you're not going to die. So she had some health issues even before she got started. And one of the big things on chronic fatigue, one of the big things that happen with that is memory and concentration problems. And that's something you really can't afford to do when you're flying. She also traveled through 14 time zones in 30 days. That's a lot. So we were probably dealing with circadian rhythm disruption, which probably wasn't studied with pilots back then because no one other than Lindbergh and a few others had traveled multiple time zones in a short period of time. Even Lindbergh, he did his trip in 33 hours, and I think he only crossed maybe 5 or 6 time zones. So he probably had jet lag when he got to France, but it probably wasn't as bad as what we're looking at here with these time zones in that amount of time. And nobody had done that, so it probably hadn't been studied. So she was probably one of the few who had done that. And then I could not find any circadian rhythm and air travel research in 1937. They did know about circadian rhythm disruption, but nobody had applied it to aviation yet. So symptoms of circadian rhythm disruption: difficulty falling and staying asleep, late night insomnia. The ones in yellow are really at risk for a pilot. Increased daytime sleepiness. That's something you don't want to have. Lack of energy in the morning. Difficulty concentrating, being alert, or accomplishing mental tasks. And believe me, with the navigation they were doing, using a sextant and charts and other manual tools for navigation, you had to be alert, you had to concentrate, you had to accomplish your mental tasks. You could not make mistakes. Some of the other ones, oversleeping and increased negative moods. We don't know how they were getting along by the time they got to Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
Another thing that may have played in this as far as human factors is something we call get-home-itis, or GHI for short. This is now recognized by the National Transportation Safety Board as a causal factor of accidents. And this is their definition: the desire to get to a destination that overrides logic, sound decision-making, and basic instinct. The urge to push on regardless of the data, telling it might not be the best decision, often fatal. She was under pressure to get this thing done. She was, at this time, she was married to George Putnam, who was the publisher. He had published the Lindbergh book, We, in I think he met her in 1927, 1928, and they were girlfriend, boyfriend, and they finally got married in 1932. He was big on publicity, and he wanted to put Amelia in that public eye. So he was basically supporting all her efforts to fly around the world. You may ask, well, how did she get the money for the airplane, the fuel, and all the things that need to be done? Well, her husband was paying for it. So she had no lack of money to do what she wanted to do. But he had a newspaper, he wanted to publish a book. He wanted to get her home so he could get on with the publicity. So there was this pressure to keep flying. And that's where you may say, well, I'm looking at the weather, it doesn't look real good, but maybe I can make it, maybe I can sneak around that. And that's when you get into trouble. You start making decisions you shouldn't be making because you want to get home. And that still affects pilots today. Diet is something else I looked at. She was extremely focused on airplane weight. Anything you don't eat on the airplane, you want to get rid of because it just slows you down, makes you use more fuel, reduces your range. So you're always thinking about being as light as you can. And they did carry minimal food supplies. Usually it was maybe some carrots, maybe some nuts, nothing very substantial. So it was light snacks in flight, and then have a big dinner on arrival, which is, let's see, is Dr. Winkler here? Yeah, you can tell us what happens when, after a big meal, you tend to get sleepy. So yeah, on departing New Guinea, they had a few cans of tomato juice. That was going to be their food for the next 10 or 12 hours. When she was leaving New Guinea, there was a witness that said she was described as emaciated and worn down before the final flight, a gentleman named Lovell who was there. So yeah, after 33 days and 14 time zones, I'd be beat too. So we'll look at the equipment now, what she was flying. She was flying a Lockheed Electra Model 10E. It was originally built to compete with the Boeing 247 and the Douglas DC-2, which were the first all-metal low-wing passenger airplanes with retractable landing gear. So it's about the size of a DC-2, DC-3. The Boeing 247 was about the same size. So it's a twin engine, radial engine, metal, all metal, flies about 200 miles an hour, about a 200 mile an hour cruise. Standard maximum takeoff weight for design was 10,500 pounds. For her flight, they added fuel tanks to the fuselage and increased the takeoff weight to 16,500 pounds. So they're running this thing about 6,000 pounds over what it was designed for. Which, you know, there are some fudge factors when they design the airplanes, so they aren't at the extreme limit of their performance at 10,000 pounds. So there's a little bit left over. She was carrying 1,151 gallons of gas, or it had, I should say, it had the capacity to hold almost 1,200 gallons of fuel. 4 of those tanks were in the fuselage, which actually blocked, you had to crawl over them to get to the navigation station and back, and then crawl over them to get to the cockpit or the flight deck. It had 80 gallons of oil for engine lubrication. Radial engines are known for using oil because of their design, so they act, because they knew they were going to run out of oil in the oil tanks behind the engines, they actually had another 80 gallons of oil that they could pump into the engine from the fuselage. So based on 1,200 gallons of gas, they should have been able to do 4,500 statute miles in zero wind based on its normal performance. So here's a cutaway her airplane. You can see the navigators in back. Here's the auxiliary fuel tanks. Here's the cockpit. They had various antennas and radios. We'll talk about some of the other equipment on there, but not a very big airplane. This is her in the airplanes laying on top of the auxiliary fuel tanks that were strapped to the fuselage. And I think we're looking toward the cockpit, the door into that. So not a whole lot of room. So I mean, you really couldn't stand up or stretch or walk around, or, you know, after 10 hours of flying, you're still sitting. As far as radio communication, she had some of the best radios of the time. She had a Western Electric transmitter, 50-watt output, and it only had 3 frequencies they could put on there with the crystals. The 3105 and the 6210 were sort of standard aviation frequencies, and then they modified it with a crystal to use 500 kilohertz, which is the marine emergency frequency. Since they were going to be flying over a lot of water, they wanted to be able to communicate with ships if they had to. But the 500 kilohertz required a 250-foot trailing wire antenna. So it was like a fishing reel. Once you took off, somebody had to go back there and reel out 250 feet of antenna while you're flying along. You couldn't land with that, so before you landed, somebody had to go back there and reel it back in. So it wasn't easy to use. You really wanted to use it if you're going to reel it out. I'm not a radio person, so they had MCW, modulated continuous wave capable, and they could use a transmitter key and use Morse code if they had to. So you had voice capability and Morse code capability. They had, which was fairly new in the time, was a Bendix radio direction finder. It could be used with, and this is something that may have been misunderstood by Amelia and her navigator, this Bendix direction finding coupler could be used with any radio on board as an antenna, but only as an antenna for receiving. It only worked with one radio for direction finding. So you could talk on one radio and you could use that as an antenna, but you wouldn't be able to use it for direction finding. You had to use a radio dedicated for that. And in the industry at the time, there was some confusion on which radio you could use and get direction finding. And that may play into what we see as we're trying to find Howland Island. And they had some problems with it. The radio direction finder did not work on the Brazil to Africa leg. it stopped working when they got to the west coast of Australia due to a blown fuse. And I was unable to find where that fuse might be located. You know, depending where the radio is located and depending where the fuse is located, you might not be able to replace it in flight, or you may not have known that was the problem. And this is where we come into this radio direction finder could only be used with the Bendix receiver and no other radios. So they did have a Bendix receiver. So this is the one where they could do direction finding. Could receive signals from the loop antenna on top, the trailing wire antenna that they had to 250 feet, and it determined direction using the loop antenna. They could actually move it around and find where the transmitter was transmitting from. But they decided it was too much bother with the trailing wire antenna, so they left it behind. So now that 500 hertz communication frequency is useless because now they don't have an antenna for it. Why they left it? That was their quote, too much bother. And that's what the radio looked like. Not an easy thing to navigate around. You definitely need a owner's manual to figure out how that works. All sorts of plugs and switches and dials. So equipment, there was an article by Joe Gurr who designed and installed the radios for the Electra for this trip. And he confirmed that the telegraph key had been removed prior to the start of the trip. They didn't take it. So they left the 250-foot wire. They left the telegraph key. So now we've lost two forms of communication. And he said the switchology, which is what we call in aviation, to use the two radios in the direction finder was complex. So you could hook the radios up to each other, you could hook the receivers up to various antennas and run the radios to other radios, but it could be confusing, could be hard to do that in flight, and could be difficult due to fatigue and lack of training. So Joe Gurr was the one that actually, since he installed them, he gave the instructions to Amelia on how to use the radios. So they actually sat in the cockpit and they were going through how the radios work, but they only spent an hour and a half because she had a publicity event to go to. So she cut it short to go to the publicity event, and he never gave her any more instruction on how to use the radios. And as she was leaving, she was quoted as saying she would have lots of time aloft to figure things out. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want my captain to say that to get on Southwest Airlines. I figured it out. They did have an Autopilot, which was really fairly new for the time. They were just starting to be developed. It was built by Sperry. It would allow hands-off flying for short intervals. It's basically a wing leveler where you could take your hands off and it would keep it straight and level and just flying without navigating. So basically held the aircraft in place so you could get a cup of coffee, look at a chart, do some navigation, but it didn't have any navigation, altitude hold, or heading hold function. So it might hold a level, but it might wander off a little bit to the left or right. It might wander up and down a little bit, very slightly, but you couldn't depend on it to hold a course if you were holding a course. So it's basically just a temporary thing so you could get your hands off the wheel and do something in between. So that could not be used for navigation. The other thing the NTSB will look at in a pilot is training and experience. So I went back and did some research looking at her first flying lessons. This was her first airplane that she had bought. It was a Kinner Airster, 60 horsepower, 70-mile-an-hour cruise. I think it's a 5-cylinder engine on that, a wooden propeller and fabric, everything. It took her 15 hours to solo, which is long, especially back then. Typically today, a student will take about 15 hours to solo, but they have control towers, they have airspace they got to stay out of, they have more complex airplanes to fly than this. So 15 hours back in the 1920s, that was a long time to solo, which tells me she didn't grasp it really quickly. It took her a while to catch on. Even on her training, one of her solo flights, she suffered a partial loss of power on takeoff. Again, we get back to the unreliability of airplanes back then. She was heading toward a row of trees, so she had a choice of either hitting the trees or stalling the airplane, which is the wing quits flying and crashed before hitting the trees. She survived, but it ruined the airplane. But it wasn't a great outcome. It could have been a better outcome. So by 1929, Earhart is now palling around with George Putnam, who wants to get her name in the paper. So they both wanted to buy a better airplane than what she had been flying. And this was back in 1929. This was probably the state-of-the-art airplane for that era. It's an enclosed cockpit. You're not in an open cockpit. Actually has windows on it, a bigger engine. So she and George Putnam went to Blanca Aircraft to buy the CH-300 pacemaker aircraft. And this would be a handful for a pilot. You'd have to be an advanced pilot to fly this. So they went there, they took a flight, they liked it, so they took a training flight with the Blanca test pilot. The test pilots saw such, and this is a quote, serious faults in her piloting skills that they refused to sell her one of the airplanes. And I think they were doing that because they didn't want her to crash and give their company a bad name. Yeah, so they were afraid it was going to look poorly on them. And this is from the Forney Museum. Before she did a lot of flying with Putnam, she paid for some of her flying by flying autogyros, which is essentially an airplane without a wing, and you use a helicopter blade for lift. And it's actually like a maple leaf that flies down. There's nothing powering it. The engine drives you forward, and that airflow makes the blades move, and that creates the lift. And she was doing it as a publicity stunt. You can just barely see it was for beech nut gum. And they had 2 or 3 of these around the country, and she was sort of barnstorming, showing this autogyro and pushing beech nut gum. And she had 3 autogyro landing accidents during her tenure as a pilot. No. Again, we're looking at experience and training. We're going, And then we get to her first attempt to go around the world. She had 3 people with her on that one, including Noonan. They made it from Oakland to Hawaii. They were attempting to take off from Hawaii and lost control of the airplane on takeoff. You can see how one of the wheels is folded up under the engine. The propeller's been knocked off. Someone watched her take off, and for some reason on her takeoff, she was using differential. The throttles are separate for each engine. Normally on takeoff, you push them both forward, you get equal power, you go straight down the runway, and you take off. For some reason, she was doing a little swerving, and she was correcting it using the different engines, which is not the way you're supposed to do that, and that's what usually happens. So it ended up going sideways and finally collapsed the gear. You couldn't take the side load, and it ended up on its belly. So they ended up shipping that on a boat back to Oakland to fix it for the next flight. So the airplane she was in had been in a previous accident. Again, back to her training, this is more experience. 1928, she's said to have about 500 hours of flight time. It was really hard to find how much flight time she had when she started going on her trip around the world. She was very active in flying, building time. In 1929, she entered the All-Women's Air Derby, which was probably sponsored by the 99s. She placed 3rd. The route was from Santa Monica to Cleveland, Ohio. It was a 9-day race. And one of the other women who placed first said she should have placed first. She had the fastest and the best airplane of anybody. So there's no reason she should have placed 3rd. So I'm wondering if she was having some navigation problems. Well, now we look at Fred Noonan, her navigator for the 2nd attempt. This guy was really well qualified. He was, for Pan American Airways, he was a navigator instructor. So he taught navigators how to fly for Pan American. He navigated the first Pan Am China Clipper round trip between Honolulu and San Francisco in 1935 successfully. So he is well known in his navigation skills. There are rumors, and you'll hear things about, Fred Noonan was an alcoholic. I did not find anything that would substantiate that, but that he might have been. If he was, and he was flying on the 2nd attempt, having those 4 fuel tanks between the navigation station and the cockpit, it would create the temptation to be drinking back there. So whether he did or not, I have no facts on that. I have not been able to find anything to substantiate that he was an alcoholic. But he was a well-known and well-experienced navigator. So on some of their navigation, This is a red flag for me if I've been flying this. On the way from Brazil to Dakar, which was less than the distance from New Guinea to Howland Island, they were 110 miles off when they hit Africa. They were supposed to land in Dakar. They landed in Senegal, 110 miles north, and their radio direction finder was inoperative. And it was said during the flight that Noonan wanted to go farther south. His navigation said, we need to be farther south. And he was overruled by Amelia Earhart, and they ended up too far north. So that would have, you know, if I miss Africa by 110 miles, and then we get to Howland Island, we're going to find something that's a mile and a half wide, I think I'd be reviewing my navigation at that point. Yeah, that's what it looked like. So they were in St. Louis, Senegal, way up the coast. Thank goodness Africa was as big as it was. So the route, Howland Island was chosen because of the aircraft's range. It was a good range from Papua New Guinea. It was just about the right fit for that airplane if it went with full fuel. Trouble is, it's only a mile and a half long, a half mile wide, and the highest point is 20 feet with no trees in the middle of the ocean. And it was the longest leg of the journey. This is going to be 2,700 miles nonstop at 200 miles an hour. So you can do the math. It's going to be about 15 hours, 15 hours of flying. They did not schedule an intermediate stop at the Gilbert Islands, which may have had an airport. Well, they put an airport on Howland Island. There was nothing there. They actually put a runway in there, a dirt runway. But there's no thought of going to the Gilbert Islands, which were in between Papua New Guinea and Howland Island.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You're saying that the island's only a mile and a half long? How much space do you need to land a plane?
That airplane probably need about 3,000 feet, so it was plenty long. 5,000 feet would be plenty for that. But yeah, there's not much there. So this is going to be the longest leg of the journey. And again, after going from Brazil to Africa and missing my destination by 100 miles, I think I'd want to review my navigation procedures. So this required very, very precise navigation and no intermediate stop. We'll look at the map here. This is what Howland Island looked like. This is from Google Earth. That's what it looks like now. It's still there. So I asked some questions too. You know, why didn't they go via Guam and Wake Island? That would have been shorter hops. They would have had something there. And lo and behold, Guam. No airport there until the Japanese built one in World War II. So it was uninhabited. Wake Island. It was used by Pan Am as a refueling stop for their flying boats, but they used the water. They landed on the water. There was no runway there. So there was no runway there until 1940. So those weren't places she could fly to and land. So this is the last leg of the flight. Lae, Papua New Guinea, open ocean. Gilbert Islands here, it actually got islands scattered along here, so if you were running off course, you might be able to identify an island and get back on course. I would have passed these in daylight. They passed it at nighttime, so they would arrive at Howland Island about 8 in the morning. So, I don't know, I think I would have thought that over a little bit different. I would have wanted to either land in the Gilbert Islands or at least be able to see them so I could tell if my navigation was any good. This was another thing. When they left New Guinea, they took off with 950 gallons of fuel, less than the maximum. Why? Because she hadn't done any takeoffs with fuel up to that point. They'd been flying with less fuel, and she was afraid to take off with max fuel. I have an airline friend whose saying is, the only time you have too much fuel is when you're on fire. You always want gas when you go somewhere. You never have too much gasoline, except when you're on fire. So they went with 950 gallons, which was 20 hours, 13 minutes of flying. If they had gone full fuel, they would have had another 4 hours of flying available to them. And this will play into when we get to Howland Island. And 4 hours of fuel is about 540 miles of range. That's a long way. If they got to Howland Island and couldn't find it, even with full tanks, they wouldn't have been able to make it back to the Gilbert Islands. There was nothing out there around Howland. They had to find Howland. So if they got within 500 miles of this. And again, if they'd seen the Gilbert Islands, they might have been able to correct their course. But there's nothing out there to look at. So, one of the other problems they didn't know about, the navigation charts they had Howland Island in the wrong place. It was 5 miles off. So now I'm looking for a 1.5 mile island. It might be 5 miles off. I may not see it when I get to where I think it is. There was nothing close for an alternate. They couldn't even go back to the Gilbert. They had to find Howland Island, which violates one of my basic tenets of flying is always leave yourself an out. Never be totally committed to one thing. Always have an alternate plan of action, airport, something. Don't have it where you gotta find it. Another thing they may not have taken into account is magnetic variation. They flew by the compass, but the trouble is magnetic north is not at north. It's not at the top of the world. It's actually around 1927. It was north of Hudson Bay here in Canada. This is where it's tracking. 2000 was here. 2010, you can see it. And here's the top. Here's the top of the Earth. It's not at north. Magnetic north is not at true north. So you have to compensate for that. There's charts for that. Did they do that? I don't know. They were exhausted. They were tired. We get back to circadian rhythm disruption where you have to be mental, your mental acuteness starts to degrade. They may have missed that. This is a chart. I actually found a 1936 chart of magnetic variation in the area of New Guinea. So around there, it was about 8 degrees off. So you had to steer wherever north was on the compass. If you wanted to go true north, you had to change it by 8 degrees. Now, which way do you change it? Do you subtract it or add it? There's different allowances. So if you do the correct allowance, you're on course. If you do no allowance, you're going to be 8 degrees off to the north. You're going to be flying north of where you want to fly. If you put the wrong one in, you subtract it instead of adding it, and pilots have done that, now you're 16 degrees off course to the south. So that's something else, and this changes throughout the world. You can see these lines of equal magnetic variation. If I'm here, it's different than it is here. So it changes as you fly. We're fortunate in St. Louis, the magnetic variation here is 0. We line up exactly with the North Pole and magnetic north. Another one is navigation accuracy, holding a course. 1 degree of error in your course for every 60 miles you travel, you'll be 1 mile off course. So from here to St. Louis, if I'm 1 degree off, I'll be 1 mile to the south of where I want to be. So for 2,700 miles, which was the leg, if I'm 1 degree off of my navigation while I'm flying, I could be 45 miles off. If I'm 8 degrees, if I don't take that magnetic variation, I could be 300 miles off. If I do the wrong one, I'll be 600 miles from Howland Island. So aids to navigation. Putnam did have some pull. The U.S. Coast Guard Itasca was stationed off Howland Island as of June 23rd to provide navigation assistance. They were able to broadcast and receive on any frequency that Earhart had. On anything that had a radio, they could talk to it. It was Morse code capable, but now we know they left their Morse code key at home. They had smoke marker by day, searchlight by night. And a searchlight will go fairly far. So there was navigation aids at Howland Island. It's not like there was nothing there. So this is a picture of the Itasca. It was stationed off there. So there were resources for them at the island, and the Itasca had fuel, oil. They're going to resupply there and then do the next leg to Hawaii. So the final flight, they departed July 22nd, 10 a.m. local. It's going to be about a 15-hour flight, or 12-hour flight. They wanted to get there about 8 o'clock the next morning or 9 o'clock the next morning. So a lot of the flight was at night, because they're also changing time zones while they're going. They did get a telegram from Ley to the Itasca that estimated 18 hours en route for an ETA of 7 a.m. at Howland Island the next day on 23rd. At 6:14, Earhart reported 200 miles from Howland. This is 6:14 in the morning. So she said she was 200 miles away. Was she? May not have been. She may have thought she was, but I don't think she had any way to verify that. And then at 7:42, Earhart transmitted they must be very close to Itasca. So they could communicate some. I think we'll get to where they could talk one way but not the other. At 8 a.m., she reports circling and requests bearings. So she wanted them to use their radio direction finder. She wanted to use hers. She reports receiving signals, which means she wanted to home in on them, but cannot determine a bearing. And this is where we may get into the confusion of the radios, where she was trying to do radio direction finding on a radio that wasn't capable, because only one of them was. She may have been using another one. Was that going on? Possibility. At 8:43, she reports flying a 157-337 bearing. So they're flying a line 337 degrees northwest and 157 degrees southeast, and they've done that with a sextant. They've determined their position, and they think they're in line with Howland Island. So they think they should be along that line, and at this point, at 8:43, they're 12 minutes past the estimated endurance of 20 hours and 13 minutes of fuel they had. It would have been nice to have that 4 hours of fuel that they left behind. So this is where they think they were. They think they were somewhere on this line, and now they're trying to figure out which way do we go. Do we go, if we're here, do we go north, or if we go south, we're going to get further away. And you'll read some of the theories of her disappearance on Nikamura Island. They think she might have crashed on there because that was in line with Howland Island. So there's some theories that she may have found that one, and no one found her there. I don't know. So after that time, the Itasca stopped receiving radio, and they never did get Morse code. So she was assumed lost at that time, and search and rescue began. So the USS Lexington, which is an aircraft carrier, was in the vicinity. It was at the international date line of the equator, which was not that far away. They launched 62 airplanes to look for her. They covered 268,000 square miles, the size of Texas, over 17 days. 7 U.S. vessels involved. At the time, it was $250,000 a day they were spending, which would be $4 million today if we did the same search now. So, they threw all the resources they had to try and find her. As far as survival aspects, the aircraft is said to have had a life raft. I've not been able to verify that. There's some people that said she did, some people said she left it behind. So, and we don't have any definitive evidence, or I have not been able to find any so far, of what other survival gear they possess. Because again, her thing was weight. They didn't want to take extra weight. They may have left that behind. We don't know. I found no evidence of survival training by either Noonan or Earhart. So if they did go down, did they have the wherewithal to know what to do when they hit the water or landed on the island or whatever happened to them? And there's no positive evidence if they ditched or were able to land on land. Again, there's a lot of theories out there. Some people say they have evidence. I don't think so. So what the NTSB does at the end of an accident investigation, they look at all these various factors, they look at what happened, they look at the experience, and they come down to a probable cause. And they say probable because they may not have all the information. They think they're pretty confident this is what happened to her. And they would word it very similarly to this. So they would say the cause of this accident was the pilot's decision or decisions to attempt the flight from Lake Papua New Guinea to Howland Island with inadequate pre-flight planning, inadequate equipment, inadequate training, inadequate experience, no risk analysis or mitigation efforts, and lack of knowledge in human factors. So pretty damning. Contributing factors. Now they'll do probable cause and they'll say, what are the contributing factors? Did not take a full fuel load from New Guinea. Why they left 4 hours of flight time on the ground, I don't know. I just can't comprehend that. I don't think they realize how difficult a mile-and-a-half island is going to be to locate, even with a Coast Guard cutter, smoke, searchlights. Again, contributing factors. They're off their navigation by 120 miles crossing the Atlantic. Let's wait a minute and see what we need to do. And did not take advantage of possible intermediate stops. I would have stopped at the Gilberts, or at least crossed them in daytime so I could see where we're going, see if we were off, use it as a checkpoint. Pre-flight planning continued, inadequate. No plan for alternate landing sites. Across the Gilbert Islands at night, could have been a checkpoint. Lack of current weather information along the route. There was no weather reporting out there. The only weather they had was Itasca, and it was reporting like scattered clouds at the time when they were supposed to get there. So the weather was not that bad, but the clouds would have hindered them trying to find the island. Another one, Howland Island's off by 5 miles. And then a question I would like to ask, was the radio direction finder functional on takeoff, and did they know how to use it? Were they using the wrong radio with the wrong antenna? Because again, our training was inadequate on the radio gear. Yeah, inadequate knowledge of radio equipment, questionable navigation skills, do they have survival training? Then we look at human factors, circadian rhythm, chronic fatigue, lack of planned crew rest. That's a big thing now in the airlines after some very public crashes where tired pilots crashed. And again, the one that we see now is the potential self-induced pressure or get-home-itis to complete the flight. Get to equipment. Survival equipment, radio direction finder. Route was at the maximum capability aircraft. They had no room for error. No trailing wire antenna, they left that behind as long as the Morse code key. And then you have to look at the en route environment. It was unpressurized. They're probably flying about 7,000 to 8,000 feet. It's very noisy. They wouldn't have insulation. They'd probably take the insulation out of it if it had any. So it's going to be very, very noisy. You're in the Pacific, so it's going to be humid, it's going to be warm. 8,000 feet, you're not going to get hypoxic or with lack of oxygen, but it can slow you down a little bit at 8,000 feet, especially at night. Uncomfortable, cramped conditions. This was not business class on Qantas. This was, you either sat in the cockpit, crawled over the fuel tanks, or sat in the navigation chair. There was no place to stand up. It wasn't high enough to even stand. So now you're dealing with, and do that for 11 hours. Let's see, and then access between navigator and pilot station. It was physical work to get between the two. I know the uncomfortable, cramped conditions. There was a story of an airline pilot who retired and wanted to relive his airline days, so he put a seat in the closet, and his wife turned on the vacuum cleaner and banged on the door and pretended he was in an airplane again. So yeah, it's noisy. So that's it. Questions? So, yes.
Was it back then? I know the planes were old.
Oh, they're new then. They were new then. Yeah.
It showed all these fuel tanks inside. If one of them could have been leaking a little, I mean, the fumes could have gotten to them too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very possible. Yeah, they were, temporary insulation, and they'd been in there for 30 days, so they've been through a lot of takeoffs and landings and maybe turbulence, so who knows? Yeah, that could have happened too, yeah. What I have is maybe not exhaustive. There may be other factors that we just haven't found yet, so. But looking at these, you wonder how she got as far as she did.
It seems to me like if I were doing that, I would not have flown at night to make that passage that they made. Their navigation was questionable at best, and they didn't have the proper navigation gear in the cockpit like we have today. So you need landmarks.
Yeah, I took some slides out to shorten it for optimists, but I have one. There was a lady in 1967, a woman flew around the world solo in a Cessna, 4-seat Cessna, and did it in like 17 days. But she had the advantage of satellite navigation, and she also used Guam and Wake Island. She bypassed New Guinea and Howland and all that. She went to those and did it successfully. But it wasn't until 1967 until a woman finally soloed around the world in an airplane.
I know, the mystery stuff and all that. I've never heard what a terrible pilot she was before.
Again,
did they know that at the time that she was that bad?
They probably didn't, because I'm sure George Putnam wanted to keep the gloss on her halo, you know, so you don't bring that stuff up. You know, people might not invest in her trips, or again, it's the appearance of being a great pilot, and she really wasn't when you start looking into it.
She seems incompetent.
Well, on her first attempt from Oakland to Hawaii, when she crashed on takeoff, she actually had 3 people with her. She had Fred Noonan and 2 other people to help her fly, so it was a crew of 4, and they either said, "We're out of here." Maybe Fred needed the money, I don't know, but it was just the 2 of them on that trip, but she had more people on the first one, and I don't know why they didn't accompany her on the second one. Yes, sir.
Being very aware of your scientific and appreciative of your logical approach, we all want to know, as an expert, what do you think happened?
I have no idea. I have no, until we get more evidence. There's people that say they have evidence. I was talking to someone before the presentation. There are a couple of groups out there that specialize in looking for Amelia Earhart bones, shoes, airplane parts, whatever out there. And I know a professor at UCM that was my accident investigation professor. He's a Amelia Earhart fan. And there says, well, this one group, I emailed them last year and said, hey, this group says they found a bone or a shoe or something. Says, oh yeah, they do that every 2 years when they start getting low on people donating money. They say they found something. So people will give them some more money to keep looking. So, yeah.
Did the airline industry immediately release a lot of this technical information right after? I mean, was the public, I knew the public, they knew she was gone, but
Yeah.
were they upfront about some of the challenges she had, or?
They probably didn't do an accident investigation because it wasn't in the United States. The CAA at that time did the accident investigations, and it was strictly limited to domestic U.S. flights. So there was probably nobody in New Guinea to do the accident review. And I think they just said, back then it was pilot error, write it off, way we go. So they didn't bother to do the research and the root cause analysis that we do in accidents today. And really what we want to do in aviation safety now, we want to find the accident before it happens. There's a great quote where, for years in the 50s and 60s, we studied aviation accidents like someone studying marriage by studying divorces. You wait till the end, and then you work your way back. Accident investigation is always, you had this big smoking hole, and then you did all this great root cause analysis, find out what happened, and go, okay, well, we'll fix that. And then you wait for the next smoking hole. Well, we said that's hard on passengers and planes. So what we're trying to do now, we try and find the precursors, and there's a whole bunch of tools. I can give another talk on that, on what we do to try and find the things that will give us a clue that something is going to happen and fix it before it happens, instead of saying, oh, we shouldn't have done that. After it crashes, we should say, we shouldn't do it that way, because someone might get hurt. So that's the way aviation safety has changed from the 20s and 40s and 50s to now, where we're trying to prevent that.
Rich, did Noonan have anything to say? I mean, you talked about her decisions and the way she was the pilot. Was he just back there like, okay, whatever?
I think probably the view they wanted to have of Amelia was that she was this all-competent pilot, and Noonan was sort of in the back, keeping her out of trouble and not getting any of the credit, giving her credit to him. I'm sure George Putnam wanted Amelia to get all the credit and be this superwoman pilot, and Noonan was sort of trying to get her from point to point. Again, they had she overruled him on the navigation to Senegal, which I find, really? Here's this guy that taught navigators, and you're going to say, no, I think we got to go this way.
So ultimately, she was the boss.
Apparently, yeah.
But is that the way it is normally? I mean, the pilot is...
Well, that's changed too. Back in the day, if you watch High and the Mighty, at some point John Wayne gets up and slaps the pilot and says, we're not going to ditch, we're going to go to Oakland. And that was sort of the first mention of crew resource management, because back then, rule number 1, the captain is always right. Rule number 2, if the captain is wrong, see rule number 1. He was God, he ran the thing. And there was a case in Portland where was a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer. The landing gear wouldn't come down. And they fool around with it, trying to get it to come down. They're working on it. And the co-pilot says, we're getting low on fuel. We're getting into our reserves. We need the land precinct. He says, no, we got plenty of time. Flight engineer said, we're getting low on fuel. We need the land precinct. Captain overrode him. What happened? The first officer and the flight engineer just shut up. They gave up, and they crashed. They ran out of fuel because they tried to be assertive, but they wouldn't listen to him. So they said, okay. So now we teach crew resource management where you listen to everything, all the resources. And a great example of that is Captain Haynes and United 232 in Sioux City, Iowa. When he lost all his hydraulics, all the flight controls froze, all he had were 2 engine throttles to fly the airplane. So he took advantage of his co-pilot. He talked to air traffic control. The flight engineer talked to maintenance on their frequency. The flight attendant came up and said, hey, we got a flight instructor for United sent back there. Can you come up and help? I said, sure, bring him on up. So he was on his knees running the throttle. So Al Haynes became the facilitator, but he took advantage of everything he had available to him. He could have said, oh, you're just a flight attendant. I'm not going to listen to you. He said, sure, bring him up. So he took advantage of all it, and that's why so many people survive. They've run that scenario since then, and everybody's killed everybody. No one's ever done it as well as he did. So you're right, that back then it was the captain as God, and it's my decision, just shut up and put the landing gear down, and that killed people. And that's part of that human factor. So in the 70s, when we had that Portland crash, people started saying, you know what, we need to have a little more equality in the cockpit.
That makes me think of the pilot that landed in, Hudson.
Sully? Yeah.
Sully, yeah.
And again, he took advantage, and I give him credit that he had a plan and he stuck with it. Sullenberger, they did a computer simulation. They said if he had turned back to LaGuardia within the first 2 minutes or something, he would have made it. He had 2 minutes to decide if he could make it back or not, and no one could make that decision. So he decided to go on the river, and air traffic control saying, well, can you make LaGuardia? No, I'm going to put it on the river. Can you make it to New Jersey? No, I'm going to put it on the river. Can you get over here? No, I'm going to put it on the river. Because he had a plan, he knew he could make it. He was a former glider pilot. And Airbus is a fantastic airplane because what he did was pull the stick all the way back, and the computer kept it from stalling, and so kept it at the minimum airspeed. He didn't have to worry about it. He just pulled the stick back, let the computer fly. Because in an Airbus, you're not hooked up to anything. It's a potentiometer. You're just hooked up to electronics. There's no physical connection to the controls. So, but he knew his airplane. He made a decision, even though people were trying to tell him other things, and he might have said, "Okay, let's go over here." He said, "I know I can make that, so I'm going to stick with a sure thing." So yeah, great example of crew resource management and using everything available to you. Very good.
Very good. Thank
Thank you.
Yes.